When Ivanka Trump allegedly told Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to go back to Africa, no one expected the measured, devastating reply that would shift the power balance in an instant. It wasn't the type of comment you hear in a bustling room and confuse for something else. It was precise, cutting, and it struck with the force of a hammer on crystal. I think you should go back to Africa. The words escaped Ivanka Trump's mouth as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment to surface. The sound seemed to cut straight through the gentle clinking of silverware on porcelain and cordial conversation. Discussion halted mid-phrase, heads turned. For several heartbeats, it felt like the entire grand ballroom at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. had been silenced. Jasmine Crockett, standing mere feet away, remained motionless. Not her hands, not her expression, not even the crystal glass of sparkling water she held. She simply stood there, gazing at Ivanka. Her stare unwavering, not icy, not furious, just concentrated. The atmosphere between them grew heavy, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. In many ways, they were. Guests who had been leaning forward to catch their companion's words now pulled back, eyes shifting from Ivanka to Crockett, from Crockett to their devices, from their devices back to the two women commanding the room's attention. No one uttered a word. Then, almost invisibly, Jasmine drew in a slow, deliberate breath. The kind you take when you understand your next words will define the moment, not just for yourself, but for everyone witnessing it.
I was born in Dallas, Texas, she began, her voice quiet but firm. My family has been here for generations. We've served in wars for this country, we've built enterprises, we've taught children, and we've paid taxes that help support the very gatherings you attend. A whisper swept through the audience. It wasn't loud, but it was sufficient to make several heads lift from their phones. Crockett continued, "So when you tell me to go back to Africa, what you're actually saying is that my place here is temporary, that it depends on your approval. And let me tell you something. This country belongs to me just as much as it belongs to you. Perhaps even more." A phone's red recording indicator blinked from a nearby table. Another guest positioned her device discreetly against her wine glass, capturing every syllable. Ivanka remained silent. She sipped her champagne and maintained her composed expression, but her eyes darted once to the side, where a handful of political contributors watched with unreadable faces. Crockett's voice didn't escalate, but it penetrated deeper with each phrase. "The irony, Miss Trump, is that your family's American story spans only a few generations. Mine stretches back to before your grandfather stepped onto Ellis Island. And unlike him, my ancestors didn't arrive here seeking opportunity. They were brought here in shackles." The gravity of that statement hung in the air like a slow, tolling bell. From the back of the room, someone cleared their throat. Another guest pushed back his chair as if suddenly uncomfortable in his formal wear. But Crockett wasn't finished.
You can attempt to diminish me with a remark like that, but all you've accomplished is proving my point about the hidden racism in our politics, about how certain people in this country still believe they get to determine who is American enough. And you just gave that belief a face.
Her tone wasn't angry. It was surgical, precise. The way someone speaks when they know they've already won the argument and they're simply delivering the final statement. The first wave of applause came from somewhere near the room's center. It was tentative at first, a single pair of hands clapping slowly, then another, until eventually the sound filled the ballroom.
Ivanka smiled tightly, nodded once, and took another sip of champagne. But she didn't say another word. Jasmine didn't need to. She turned slightly, thanked the people around her, and stepped back from the center of attention. She wasn't retreating. She was leaving the stage, figuratively speaking, knowing the real performance was only just beginning. Because in that room, phones had been recording, and in just a few hours, the outside world would witness exactly what had transpired within these walls. The conversation was about to become much larger than one uncomfortable exchange at a fundraising dinner. But before the cameras and headlines, there was the room itself, the people in it, the power they wielded, and the stakes they were playing for that night. That part of a story matters just as much. The Mayflower Hotel ballroom that evening was a masterclass in power disguised as refinement. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over circular tables draped in cream linen. Each place setting was polished to perfection. Silver utensils, crystal stemware, name cards written in flowing gold script, the kind of event where the real conversations happen away from microphones, where deals aren't signed but are quietly sealed with a handshake. It wasn't just another DC fundraiser. This was the annual Liberty Foundation dinner, an invitation-only gathering that attracted not just donors, but the people who could make a midnight phone call and alter the course of legislation. The kind of crowd where a senator might find themselves in casual conversation with a tech mogul, or a retired general sharing a quiet laugh with a media executive.
Jasmine Crockett wasn't there by accident. Her record in Congress on voting rights and economic reform had made her both a rising star and a lightning rod. Some guests admired her, others saw her as a threat to the established order. But either way, they paid attention when she spoke. Ivanka Trump's presence, on the other hand, was calculated. She had stepped away from a formal politics after her father's presidency, but everyone in that room knew she still wielded influence. The organization she was representing that night wasn't officially tied to the campaign, but the message was clear. She was still a player in the game. The seating arrangement told its own story. Crockett's table wasn't far from the podium, which gave her a direct view to nearly every corner of the ballroom. Ivanka's table was just 3 away, positioned with some of the evening's biggest contributors. It wasn't coincidence that their paths crossed between courses. In the room, conversations drifted from inflation to midterm projections, whispers about Supreme Court rulings, and murmured speculation about who might run for the next open Senate seat in Ohio. But beneath all of that was a shared awareness. Every interaction here had weight. A handshake, a compliment, even an offhand remark could have found its way into a headline if the wrong person overheard it. That's what made Ivanka's comment so shocking. Not just the words themselves, but where they were spoken. These were people trained in the art of controlling the narrative. And yet here it was, a raw, unfiltered insult delivered in one of the most carefully managed environments in Washington. Across the room, a political consultant named Brian Alford leaned toward his colleague and muttered, "Did she really just say that?" His colleague, eyes still on Crockett, nodded almost imperceptibly.
At the far end of the bar, a veteran journalist, Grace Whitmore, had been nursing a bourbon and working through a mental list of who she needed to corner for quotes. But after hearing Ivanka's words, she knew her night had just changed direction entirely. She quietly reached for her phone, typed a quick message to her editor, and added a single line. "You're going to want to see this." Even the waitstaff sensed the shift. A server carrying a tray of dessert plates slowed her step, glancing toward the center of the room before setting them down. Years in the service industry had taught her to recognize when something important was happening, even if she didn't know exactly what it was.
For Crockett, though, the stakes weren't just about the optics. This was about principle. She'd built her career on challenging people who thought power gave them the right to diminish others. The fact that it had happened here in front of people who controlled millions in political donations only amplified the moment. But there was something else, something less visible to the casual observer. Crockett understood that in politics, moments like this don't just end when the conversation is over. They live on. They're repeated, reinterpreted, and replayed until they become part of the public record. And the way you handle them can define your career for years to come. So while Ivanka's comment was still hanging in the air, Crockett knew the cameras in people's pockets were now her audience. The donors and politicians at the tables were secondary. The real stage had just shifted to the millions of people who would watch this later with the benefit of slow-motion replays, captions, and hashtags. As the murmurs faded and the applause began, you could almost feel the story crystallizing in real time. Some guests avoided eye contact, knowing their presence here might soon be questioned. Others leaned in closer to Crockett, offering quiet words of support, eager to be associated with the moment. But if you watched closely, you could see Ivanka glance toward the side exit, not in panic but in calculation. She knew she had just given her critics ammunition, and that Crockett was the type to load every bullet. But to understand why this remark cut so deep, you have to know the history between these two women, and how their paths had been circling each other long before this night. This wasn't the first time Jasmine Crockett and Ivanka Trump's worlds had collided, though until now it had always been from a distance. Crockett had entered the national spotlight years earlier as a relentless voice on Capitol Hill, challenging voter suppression efforts and calling out systemic inequities in federal policy. Her style was sharp but deliberate. She had a way of framing her points so they stuck, often in ways her opponents couldn't easily rebut. That same precision had made her a favorite guest on political talk shows and a growing name in activist circles. Ivanka, meanwhile, had spent her years after the White House positioning herself as a polished, apolitical brand ambassador. Appearing at select conferences, engaging in carefully chosen philanthropic efforts, and avoiding the sharper edges of political commentary. But Crockett's criticisms of the Trump administration had cut close to home, and Ivanka knew it. The first public intersection between them came during a televised roundtable on economic development 2 years prior. Crockett had been invited to speak about job creation programs in underserved communities. Ivanka, appearing via video link, had touted her work on workforce initiatives during her father's presidency. The exchange had been civil, but Crockett's closing line, "Workforce programs mean nothing if the people creating them don't understand the communities they're serving," had gone viral. It wasn't a direct shot at Ivanka, but the internet treated it like one. Within hours, clips were circulating with headlines like, "Crockett's subtle swipe at Ivanka Trump lights up social media." Ivanka never commented publicly, but according to insiders, she wasn't pleased. Over the next year, Crockett's speeches and interviews occasionally referenced political dynasties profiting off the backs of working people. She never named Ivanka, but the undertone was there. And in Washington, where reading between the lines is an Olympic sport, everyone knew who she meant. Ivanka's irritation reportedly deepened after Crockett took the stage at a civil rights rally in Philadelphia and spoke about wealth and privilege acting as gatekeepers to democracy. Cameras caught Crockett shaking hands with senators, civil rights leaders, and even a few prominent business executives who had previously been aligned with the Trumps. For Ivanka, the message was clear. Crockett wasn't just talking policy. She was building alliances that could challenge her family's influence. Then came the op-ed 6 months before the dinner. Crockett wrote a piece in the Washington Post criticizing the selective patriotism of certain political figures. "It's easy to love America when it serves your interests," she wrote. "It's harder and far more meaningful to love it enough to fight for those it leaves behind." While the op-ed didn't mention Ivanka by name, it cited programs and initiatives unmistakably linked to her tenure in the White House. People close to Ivanka said she saw it as an unnecessary provocation. To her, Crockett wasn't just a political adversary. She was someone using calculated language to erode the carefully curated image Ivanka had spent years crafting. And yet, until that night at the Mayflower, the tension had lived mostly in speeches, op-eds, and indirect jabs. There had never been a face-to-face confrontation without cameras and moderators. The irony? Crockett hadn't planned to interact with Ivanka at all that evening. Her seat had been assigned long before the guest list was finalized, and she was there to speak briefly about election integrity initiatives in states like Texas and Florida. Ivanka's attendance wasn't even confirmed until 2 days before the event. But when the dessert course was served, Crockett stepped away from her table to greet a donor she'd been hoping to meet for months. She crossed the floor, exchanged a few words, and as she turned to leave, found herself face to face with Ivanka. Polite smiles, measured tones. The kind of exchange where both women knew exactly who they were speaking to, but pretended not to. "You've been busy," Ivanka said, her voice carrying just enough of a smile to sound cordial, but not enough to hide the undertone. "Busy is good," Crockett replied evenly, "especially when there's so much to be done." From there, the conversation shifted quickly. Talk of voting rights legislation, state-level reforms, and the growing rift between federal protections and local enforcement. Crockett made her points plainly, never raising her voice, never showing irritation, but her clarity left little room for evasion. Ivanka, according to witnesses, began to look less like a hostess making small talk and more like someone defending her record. Her answers grew shorter, her smile tighter. And then, as Crockett pressed the point about how certain federal rollbacks had disproportionately hurt minority voters, Ivanka delivered the line. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of simmering irritation, bruised pride, and the realization that this was one conversation she wasn't going to win. But to grasp why Crockett's response hit with such force, you have to hear the moments leading right up to Ivanka's remark, and how quickly that polite exchange turned into a political flashpoint. By the time Jasmine Crockett and Ivanka Trump were standing face to face, the din of the ballroom seemed like background noise neither woman was paying much attention to. It was the kind of moment where a conversation narrowed to a pinpoint, Every word weighed for what it might mean later. Voting rights legislation is one of those things people like to talk about in theory, Ivanka began, tilting her head slightly. But the reality is, reforms have to work for everyone, not just one group. Crockett didn't flinch. They should work for everyone. But when certain changes lead to people in rural communities voting without trouble, while people in urban districts wait in line for hours, that's not balance. That's selective access. Ivanka took a sip from her glass as if buying herself a moment. Sometimes those differences have more to do with local management than federal policy. That's convenient, Crockett replied, her voice calm. Blame it on local management, and the people who design the policies never have to take responsibility for the impact. The exchange might have ended there, two women with opposing views parting politely, if not for the way Crockett leaned in just slightly. Not aggressive, but intentional. I've walked through polling stations in Detroit and Phoenix and Dallas, and I've seen the pattern firsthand. Fewer machines, longer waits, poll workers stretch thin, and the people it affects most are black and brown voters. Ivanka's smile tightened. Jasmine, you make it sound like there's a grand conspiracy. Not a conspiracy, Crockett said. Just the same results happening over and over again, when the people writing the rules aren't the ones standing in those lines. At a nearby table, a pair of donors had stopped mid-conversation, clearly tuned in. One of them, a man in a tailored navy suit, suddenly shifted his chair to get a better angle, his phone now resting on the table, screen up. Ivanka's tone cooled a degree. You know, there's a difference between fighting for your community and constantly framing yourself as its only voice. I've never claimed to be the only voice, Crockett said evenly. But I won't apologize for being one of the loud ones. Silence doesn't get polling stations opened earlier. It doesn't get voter rolls cleaned up fairly. And it doesn't keep certain politicians from deciding who gets to participate in democracy and who doesn't. The pause that followed was short, but you could feel the shift in the conversation's temperature. This was no longer a polite policy disagreement. It was personal. Ivanka's eyes flickered to a man in a dark blazer standing a few feet away, a longtime family associate, before returning to Crockett. I think, she said slowly, that maybe if you're so unhappy with how this country works, you might want to go back to Africa. The words dropped into the space between them like lead. They didn't echo. They didn't need to. Every person within earshot heard them clearly. For half a second, no one moved. The donor with the phone on the table didn't bother to hide the fact that he just tapped the record button. A woman standing behind Crockett covered her mouth, her eyes wide. Crockett blinked once. Say that again. Ivanka didn't repeat herself. She simply held her gaze, a small smile still in place. That was when Crockett's voice, low and measured, cut through the heavy silence. You think my citizenship is optional? That it's some kind of trial period? My family has been in this country for over 200 years. We fought in wars long before your father was in the White House, long before your grandfather was in this country. So the next time you think about telling someone where they should go, you might want to remember where you came from. Her tone didn't waver, and yet in the way she said it, there was no mistaking the underlying message. This wasn't just a response. It was a dismantling. At another table, a state representative from Ohio leaned over to whisper to her dinner partner, "She just ended her..." The conversation was over. Ivanka didn't attempt a rebuttal, didn't shift her stance, didn't even try to redirect. She simply turned slightly toward another guest, as if the exchange had been nothing more than an interruption. But it wasn't over. Not really. The cameras were rolling now. The story had just been written in real time. And every person who'd heard it knew it would be repeated by morning. But Crockett's rebuttal wasn't just a single line. It was the opening to a larger statement that would turn a personal insult into a national moment. The weight of Ivanka's remark hadn't even fully settled before the room began to react in subtle, telling ways. Conversations that had been flowing moments earlier hit abrupt stops. A few people shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the two women, as though they'd just stumbled into a scene they weren't sure they should be witnessing. Some reactions were almost imperceptible, a raised eyebrow here, a clenched hand there. But others were harder to hide. One guest at the edge of the room muttered something under his breath to the person beside him, only to receive a warning glance from a table mate urging him to keep quiet. A cluster of donors near the bar lowered their voices, but not before one of them said, "That's going to be a problem." Crockett stood perfectly still for a few seconds longer. Her eyes didn't leave Ivanka's face, but she wasn't staring her down. It was more like she was taking stock, measuring the comment for what it truly was, and deciding how she wanted to answer it. Then she spoke. "I want to make sure I heard you right," she said, clearly enough for the surrounding tables to catch every word. "Because if I did, what you just said isn't just wrong. It's exactly what's wrong with the way too many people in positions of privilege think about belonging in this country." Ivanka kept her posture straight, one hand loosely holding the stem of her champagne glass. She didn't interrupt. "My family has been American for centuries," Crockett continued. "We didn't buy our way into this country. We didn't arrive on a luxury liner and start a business with inherited wealth. We were forced here, stripped of our names, our languages, and our freedoms. Still, generation after generation, we've fought to make this place better, often for people who never wanted us here in the first place." The room was no longer pretending not to listen. Heads were turned, forks resting silently on plates. "You say something like that to me, and it's not just an insult to me personally. It's a dismissal of every black soldier who fought under this flag. It's a dismissal of every black teacher who's educated America's children. It's a dismissal of every voter who stood in line for hours because their precinct had half the resources of the one across town." A faint murmur rolled through the crowd, but no one broke in. "And here's the truth," Crockett added, her voice steady but now carrying a sharper edge. "Telling someone to go back doesn't come from patriotism. It comes from fear. Fear that the people you've overlooked, the people you've underestimated, are not only still here but are thriving, succeeding, and refusing to be silent." She let that sink in for a moment before delivering the final cut. "So if you think my being here is somehow a problem for you, I suggest you get used to it, because I'm not going anywhere." The applause started slowly, just as it had before. One or two pairs of hands clapping in the middle of the room, but this time it grew faster, louder, spreading from table to table until the sound filled every corner of the ballroom. Some stood, some simply clapped from their seats, but the approval was unmistakable. Ivanka's reaction was careful. She didn't roll her eyes or smirk. She gave a small, polite smile, the kind that could be read as either graciousness or calculated control. She raised her glass slightly as if acknowledging the applause, though it was clear it wasn't meant for her. A handful of guests exchanged glances, some impressed by Crockett's composure, others clearly unsettled by the fact that this confrontation had happened at all in such a controlled setting. The Liberty Foundation dinner was supposed to be about influence behind closed doors, not viral moments. Yet here they were, witnessing one being born. Across the room, Grace Whitmore, the journalist who'd been nursing a bourbon earlier, had her phone angled low but steady, recording the exchange. She knew instinctively that what she'd just captured could run on the evening news. And if handled right, it would. The energy in the room didn't fully return to normal after that. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter, more fragmented. People who had been relaxed over steak and wine now seemed to be calculating what their presence in this moment might mean if clips began circulating. Ivanka remained at her table, smiling politely at whoever spoke to her, but her attention kept drifting toward the guests who were still watching from a distance. Crockett, meanwhile, returned to her seat, accepting quiet handshakes and brief words of praise from those nearby. No one said it out loud, but everyone in that room understood what had just happened. A high-profile figure had said something that could not be unsaid, and her target had responded in a way that elevated her standing rather than diminishing it. But Crockett's answer wasn't just about this one moment. It was the kind of response that would resonate far beyond the walls of the Mayflower Hotel once the footage hit the public. What made Crockett's answer so powerful wasn't just the words, it was how she delivered them. There was no tremor in her voice, no flash of visible anger. She didn't raise her tone to match the sting of Ivanka's remark. She stayed composed, deliberate, even conversational. That control was its own statement. People in politics know that public perception hinges as much on body language as it does on sound bites. A flare of temper, a slip in tone, these can overshadow the message. Crockett knew it, and she wielded that knowledge like a scalpel. She didn't just speak to Ivanka, she spoke to the room. She spoke to the servers gliding silently between tables, the lobbyists leaning back in their chairs, the donors who'd been sipping wine moments before. And perhaps most importantly, She spoke to the cameras in people's pockets, knowing that her real audience would be watching later from couches, subway cars, and office desks across the country. My great-grandfather, she said, wore the uniform of the United States Army in World War II. He fought in Europe at a time when he couldn't sit at a lunch counter back home without being told to leave. My grandmother picked cotton in Texas as a girl and still managed to put herself through nursing school. My father served as a firefighter for 32 years. So don't you tell me or anyone like me that we don't belong here. We've earned this place 10 times over. There was a pause, a heavy one before she continued. Your family's American story began just a few decades ago. Mine began before this country even recognized people who looked like me as citizens. And yet here we are. I am not a guest in this country. I am part of its foundation. Her voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. Several guests shifted forward in their seats, drawn in by the rhythm of her words. A few even leaned over their tables to catch every sentence. Crockett took another slow breath and let her eyes scan the room. The thing about telling someone to go back is that it's meant to make them feel small. It's meant to remind them of a place you think they should stay in, some imaginary boundary you believe they shouldn't cross. But here's the truth. That boundary exists only in your mind. And the people you want to keep inside it are the same people who've been tearing it down for generations. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not noisy enough to disrupt her, but noticeable. She pressed on. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about the danger of thinking that citizenship, or belonging, is something you get to grant or take away. The United States belongs to every one of its citizens equally. Whether their family came here on a boat in 1903, across a border in 1976, or in chains in 1620. No exceptions. The applause came again, stronger this time. And as it grew, Crockett didn't raise her chin in triumph or flash a victorious smile. She simply gave a small nod of acknowledgement to those clapping, then returned her attention to Ivanka. Now, I could choose to be angry about what you just said, she added, but anger would give it more power than it deserves. Instead, I'll do what I always do. Turn it into fuel. Because comments like yours, they're the reason I ran for office. They're the reason I fight for voting rights, education access, and fair representation. And as long as I'm in this position, I'm going to keep fighting. That's my promise, not just to you, but to everyone watching this right now. The words "everyone watching this right now" landed like a quiet warning. People in the room understood what she meant. This exchange wasn't going to stay here. It was already halfway out the door in the form of texts, tweets, and video clips. Ivanka's expression didn't crack, but her stillness was telling. She glanced down at her champagne, then back up, and simply said, "Well, I see you feel strongly about this." Crockett didn't miss a beat. "I feel strongly about justice," she said. There it was. The pivot. She had taken the remark and reframed it, making it about a universal value rather than just a personal insult. It was the kind of rhetorical turn that politicians spend years learning to master. At one table, a man in a gray suit whispered to his wife, "She just owned that moment completely." His wife nodded slightly, still watching Crockett as if she'd just witnessed a live debate stage. The moment hung for a beat longer before Crockett stepped back, ending the direct exchange. She returned to her table, but the energy in the room didn't follow her. It stayed buzzing in the air, hanging over the white tablecloths and half-eaten desserts. The fundraiser continued. Speeches were made, donations pledged, but every conversation seemed to loop back to that moment. People recounted it to their table mates, already altering details, already shaping it into the version they would tell later. But it wasn't just the people in that room who were about to dissect what had happened, because the recordings were on their way to the outside world, and the reaction would be nothing short of explosive. Even as the fundraiser tried to roll on, it was obvious the rhythm of the evening had been permanently disrupted. The string quartet in the corner kept playing, their soft harmonies meant to smooth over the tension, but the crowd wasn't hearing the music anymore. They were hearing Crockett's words replaying in their heads. A few guests tried to carry on with polite conversation, but the tone had shifted. Where there had been easy smiles earlier, now there were glances over shoulders, quick side-eyes toward the center of the room, and whispered exchanges no one wanted overheard. At one table near the back, a lobbyist named Gregory Pike leaned toward a state senator from Nevada. That, he murmured, was a masterclass. Calm, factual, lethal. The senator gave a short, thoughtful hum of agreement before turning her gaze back toward Crockett's table. Over by the dessert buffet, two younger congressional aides who had been working the room for contacts huddled together, phones out, comparing clips they'd just captured. One of them, Marissa, sharp and quick-talking, shook her head. She didn't even blink. You can't teach that kind of composure. Across the room, the journalists in attendance were doing their own quick calculations. Grace Whitmore had already sent her editor a 30-second video file, knowing it would get flagged by the newsroom as breaking content. A political columnist for a major online outlet was scribbling in his notebook, the kind of shorthand only he could read, already shaping his lead in his mind. For the donors, the real power players in the room, the moment wasn't just about political theater. It was about alignment. Publicly siding with Crockett could curry favor with progressive causes. Staying silent could keep them in good standing with Trump allies. Choosing wrong could cost millions in influence. So they sat, watched, and weighed every angle like it was a chessboard. But the nonverbal reactions were impossible to hide. One donor, a tall man with a shock of white hair, kept his gaze fixed firmly on his plate, stabbing at a half-eaten slice of cheesecake as though avoiding eye contact could make the incident disappear. Another, a woman in a deep green dress, allowed herself the faintest smile when Crockett's words were mentioned at her table. Meanwhile, Crockett herself sat at her table as if nothing had happened. She accepted a glass of water from a server, thanked him quietly, and then leaned in to speak with the colleague seated to her left. The conversation seemed light, almost casual, but every so often her eyes swept the room, clocking who was watching and who was avoiding her gaze. Ivanka's table was a study in controlled poise. She kept her shoulders straight, her smile polite, her voice measured as she spoke with those beside her. But anyone watching closely could see the small giveaways, the quick tightening of her grip on the stem of her glass, the fraction of a second pause before answering someone's question. It wasn't panic, but it wasn't comfort either. One of her closest allies at the table, a well-known donor from Florida, leaned in and whispered something. Ivanka's lips curved into a faint smile at whatever was said, but her eyes didn't quite match the expression. Phones continued to record, though now it was more discreet. Aides were texting their bosses. Journalists were typing out notes. Somewhere in that ballroom, the first few tweets about what just happened were already being drafted. The quiet drama of the moment was that everyone knew the incident had legs. By tomorrow, it would be the subject of op-eds, panel discussions, and cable news segments. And depending on how each clip was edited, it could paint either woman in dramatically different lights. But the truth was, Crockett's composure had made her almost impossible to attack without looking petty. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't used personal insults. She'd stuck to history, principle, and patriotism. Even her detractors would have to admit, privately at least, that she'd handled herself flawlessly. One longtime political strategist at the far end of the room summed it up quietly to his dinner partner. That's how you turn an attack into a platform. She just made herself the headline. The senator from Nevada, still watching Crockett from across the room, took a sip of her wine and replied, and Ivanka handed it to her, gift-wrapped. As the evening wound down, people began making their rounds to say polite goodbyes, but the social choreography felt different. Some guests approached Crockett to shake her hand, thanking her for what she'd said. Others avoided her entirely, heading straight for the exit without another glance. Ivanka, for her part, received her own quiet line of well-wishers, though their smiles felt more like damage control than genuine warmth. The final speaker took the stage, thanked everyone for their generosity, and made the standard closing remarks about continuing the fight for shared values. But by then, everyone knew the real story of the night had already happened. And it wasn't about the dinner's cause or its fundraising total, but the story was about to grow far beyond these walls, because the first videos were already hitting social media before the last guests even stepped outside. By the time the last black sedan pulled away from the Mayflower Hotel's valet line, the first clips were already ricocheting across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The very first video to hit the internet was grainy but clear enough. Ivanka's voice unmistakable, delivering the line, "Go back to Africa," followed by Crockett's calm, deliberate rebuttal. The clip was only 38 seconds long, but it was the spark that lit the fire. Within minutes, a second angle surfaced. This one, taken from a different table, showed more of the room's reaction. The shocked glances, the frozen expressions, the quick flashes of camera lights as people tried to capture the moment without drawing attention. By the time midnight rolled around, Jasmine Crockett was trending nationwide. Hashtags multiplied, Crockett clapback, go back where, Liberty dinner leak. Cable news caught wind fast. On MSNBC, the late-night anchor interrupted a scheduled segment on international trade to roll the footage, calling it one of the most striking exchanges we've seen between a sitting member of Congress and a member of the Trump family in recent memory. CNN's political panel queued up both clips side by side, breaking down body language, tone, and intent like it was a slow-motion sports replay. Fox News took a different angle. They led with the headline, "Out of context, clip sparks online frenzy. What really happened at the Liberty Foundation dinner?" And spent the next 10 minutes framing it as a politically motivated attack on Ivanka Trump. But the mainstream coverage was only part of the story. On TikTok, creators were already adding captions, reaction videos, and side-by-side comparisons of Crockett's remarks with her past speeches on voting rights. Some edits layered in dramatic music, turning the moment into a mini-political epic. Others used humor, looping Ivanka's comment over and over, followed by clips of people saying, "try again," or "wrong answer." The impact on Crockett's public profile was immediate. Her follower count on Twitter jumped by 47,000 in a matter of hours. On Instagram, screenshots of her quotes were racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Her staff's inbox was flooded with requests for interviews from The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and late-night talk shows. Inside her D.C. townhouse, Crockett's team huddled in the living room around a laptop. Malika, her communications director, was already drafting a short, measured statement. "We stick to the facts," she said, her voice decisive. "No extra punches, just a reminder of what was said and why it matters." Crockett nodded. "I want the clip to speak for itself. If we overplay it, we look like we're milking it. If we underplay it, we miss the chance to call out what this is." Across town, Ivanka's circle was scrambling. In a conference call that stretched into the early hours, advisors debated whether to issue a denial, claim the remark was taken out of context, or stay silent and hope the storm passed. The consensus was fractured. One camp urged a quick, apologetic clarification to blunt the outrage. Another insisted any acknowledgement would validate the clip. By dawn, the story had spread to every major outlet. Morning shows looped the footage, inviting legal analysts, historians, and former politicians to weigh in. Some framed Crockett as a symbol of grace under pressure. Others argued the incident was proof of the deep fractures in American political discourse. In Philadelphia, a teacher played the clip for her high school civics class, sparking an impromptu debate among students about free speech, patriotism, and the responsibilities of public figures. In Phoenix, a local radio station devoted an entire hour to listener call-ins, most of them praising Crockett's composure. By the end of the day, her office had received more than 290 voicemails from constituents, most of them supportive. One caller, an elderly veteran from Ohio, left a message saying, "I fought for this country too, and I've been told the same thing you were told last night. Thank you for standing up without losing your cool." Even international outlets picked up the story. The BBC ran it under the headline, "U.S. Congresswoman responds to racist remark with viral speech." Al Jazeera featured it in their world news section, highlighting it as an example of moments when political rhetoric crosses into personal territory. Back in D.C., Crockett walked into her office the next morning, to a room full of tired but energized staffers. Malika slid a stack of printed emails across the desk. "We're going to need to sort through these," she said. "A lot of invitations. A lot of, let's just say, passionate responses." Crockett skimmed the top email, then looked up. "The question now is, do we control the story or do we let it run wild?" Malika's answer was immediate. "We control it. And we start today." But the harder question, and the one that would define the next phase, was how Ivanka's camp would respond, and whether their next move would calm the storm or pour gasoline on it. By mid-morning, the Trump camp's headquarters in Palm Beach had gone into full crisis mode. The sun was barely up over the Atlantic when Ivanka's top advisors, public relations staff, and a few trusted family allies crowded into the long, glass-walled conference room on the second floor. Phones were buzzing nonstop. Laptops were open to trending dashboards, every screen showing Crockett's name climbing higher in searches. Ivanka sat at the head of the table, hair perfectly in place despite the early hour. She wasn't visibly rattled, but the tightness in her jaw gave her away to anyone who knew her well. On her left, her communications director, Brent Farlow, clicked through a series of slides showing social media metrics, news coverage, and polling snapshots. "Here's the reality," Brent said, pointing to a chart that looked like a sharp, sudden mountain peak. Overnight, Crockett's favorability numbers spiked by 8 points among independents. 8 points. That's unheard of for an incident less than 12 hours old. "And our numbers?" Ivanka asked. Brent hesitated. "They're flat among core supporters, but among swing voters, there's a drop. 2 points so far and trending downward." Ivanka's chief of staff, a crisp-spoken woman named Lauren Chizek, leaned forward. "We have 2 options. 1. Issue a statement saying the remark was taken out of context. Stress that you were speaking about political philosophy, not race. 2. Ignore it entirely. Ride out the news cycle and hope she overplays her hand." A man at the far end of the table, Tom Savers, a longtime family strategist, shook his head. "Option 2 is risky. This isn't a fringe blog post. Every major outlet is running it. Ignoring it makes it look like we can't defend it. And if she keeps her cool in every interview, we're the ones who look reactive." Lauren countered, "Issuing a statement draws a second wave of attention. It guarantees more coverage." They went back and forth like that for 18 minutes. Finally, Ivanka raised her hand slightly, quieting the room. "If I say it was about political philosophy, will anyone believe me?" Brent's silence was the answer. "Then we pivot," Ivanka said. "We talk about unity, shared values, working together despite differences. We position it as a misunderstanding without repeating the words. And we do it in my voice, not through a press release. A sit-down interview. Controlled setting. One network." Tom frowned. "And which network is going to handle that gently right now?" "I'll make a few calls," Ivanka said flatly. Meanwhile, across town, Crockett's team was taking a different approach. Malika had pulled up a list of the day's most prominent interview requests. Good Morning America, The View, NPR's All Things Considered. "We pick 3, Malika told the group. 1 national morning show, 1 evening cable spot, 1 radio or podcast. We don't saturate. We make every appearance count." Crockett agreed. "I don't want to sound like I'm just milking it for headlines. But I do want to frame this for what it is. An example of how prejudice, even when it's dressed up in polite company, still shapes the way some people think about belonging in America." They mapped out talking points, keeping them tight and repeatable. No long policy lectures, no tangents. Every answer would circle back to history, shared values, and why representation matters. While Crockett was preparing to speak publicly, Ivanka's team was busy trying to close ranks. Allies were contacted and asked, some more forcefully than others, to put out tweets about respecting different viewpoints and staying focused on issues that unite us. A few complied, posting vague statements that skirted the incident entirely. Others declined, wary of being dragged into the firestorm. One of Ivanka's more media-savvy friends floated the idea of releasing a photo from the dinner of the 2 women smiling in conversation, framing it as evidence that the exchange had been respectful disagreement. But when the PR team reached out to a photographer who'd been working the event, he admitted that no such photo existed. Every image from the night showed the 2 women either speaking intently or standing apart. By the end of the day, Ivanka had secured a spot on a primetime cable interview with a sympathetic host. The plan was to focus on her philanthropic work, slip in a few comments about misunderstandings in the age of social media, and avoid repeating the remark verbatim. The hope was to soften the blow without reigniting the outrage. But the timing was working against her. Crockett's Good Morning America appearance was scheduled for the next morning, hours before Ivanka's interview would air. That meant Crockett's framing of the event would likely be the one most Americans heard first. And in politics, first impressions are hard to rewrite. But Crockett's real advantage wasn't just the order of the interviews. It was the way her story resonated beyond politics, turning her into something bigger than a single moment in a ballroom. By the time Jasmine Crockett sat down in the Good Morning America studio the next morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. The producers didn't need to hype the segment. Viewers were tuning in specifically to hear her speak. Cameras rolled. The host welcomed her. And Crockett wasted no time. "I'm not here to relive a single comment," she began. "I'm here to talk about what that comment represents and why it still happens in 2025. Her voice was steady, warm even, but every sentence carried weight. She talked about the long history of Black Americans who had been told, in ways big and small, that they didn't belong. She reminded viewers that her own family's sacrifices, military service, community leadership, public safety, were part of the very fabric of the country. And she framed the remark not as an isolated insult, but as a reminder that prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in a whisper or in a perfectly set ballroom over champagne. The host asked if she believed Ivanka's words were intentional. Crockett didn't take the bait. "I can't speak to what's in someone else's heart," she said, "but I can speak to the impact, and the impact is this. Comments like that signal to millions of people that their Americanness is conditional. That's not acceptable, no matter who says it, no matter where they say it." Social media lit up within minutes. People praised her refusal to be drawn into personal attacks, her focus on the bigger picture. Clips from the interview circulated alongside footage from the dinner, reinforcing the contrast. A poised Congresswoman against the backdrop of an unguarded remark. In living rooms across the country, the moment sparked conversations that weren't about party lines or specific policies, but about belonging, identity, and respect. Some people shared personal stories of being told they should go back somewhere despite having lived in the United States their whole lives. Others admitted they'd never realized how common such experiences were until they saw Crockett's response. That afternoon, Crockett's office released a short video message on her social channels. Standing in front of a plain backdrop, she spoke directly to the camera. "If you've ever been told you don't belong here, I want you to hear me clearly. You do. Your contributions matter, your voice matters, and no one gets to take that from you. Not with a comment, not with a policy, not with anything." The video went viral, not just political viral, but genuinely viral. Shared by athletes, musicians, teachers, community leaders. For once, the internet's attention wasn't on tearing someone down, but on amplifying a message of inclusion. Meanwhile, Ivanka's carefully planned primetime interview aired that evening. The lighting was flattering, the questions gentle. She spoke about her philanthropic work, emphasized miscommunications in a fast-moving media landscape, and pivoted to topics like job training and women's entrepreneurship. But it was clear the public had already chosen the narrative they believed, and it wasn't hers. In the days that followed, Crockett's profile rose even higher. She was invited to keynote a leadership conference in Boston, deliver the commencement address at a college in California, and appear on a Sunday political panel that had previously been dominated by more established figures. Her campaign donations spiked, not just from her district, but from across the country. But for Crockett, the most meaningful responses came from ordinary people. A handwritten letter from a retired nurse in Oklahoma. A drawing from a middle school student in Oregon showing Crockett speaking at a podium. A voicemail from a man in Alabama thanking her for showing my granddaughter what strength looks like. When asked later how she'd kept her composure in that ballroom, Crockett said, "It wasn't about me. If I'd made it about me, I would have just been angry. But I was thinking about every person who's been in that position before, hearing those words, feeling that sting. I wanted them to see that you can answer without lowering yourself. And that was the real moral of the moment. Strength isn't just about volume, it's about control. Dignity under pressure can speak louder than outrage. And sometimes the best way to counter an insult is to turn it into a mirror, one that reflects the truth back so clearly that no one can look away." As Crockett closed out her Boston keynote a month later, she left the audience with a challenge. If you're in the room when someone draws a line meant to exclude you, you have two choices. You can step back and let it stand, or you can stand on it and make it your platform. I know which one I'll choose every single time. That applause wasn't just polite. It was sustained, deep, and filled with the kind of energy that meant people were leaving the room ready to carry the message forward. So if you're watching this and you've ever been in a position where someone tried to make you feel like you didn't belong, remember, your response can rewrite the moment. Your words can travel further than their insult ever will, and your dignity, once shown, can't be taken back.